Question is the report be considered and noted. The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to speak on this motion, the noting of the report of the Joint Standing Committee on Greyhound Racing Transition on the Greyhound Racing Legislation Amendments Phasing Out Reforms Bill 2025 inquiry. I'm mindful, Mr President, this is not a debate on the bill itself, which may well come, but a noting debate on the report of the inquiry on the bill. And as a member of the Joint Standing Committee on Greyhound Racing Transition, I'm able to provide comment and reflection on the report of the inquiry, and it may be in a position to provide some extra clarification on matters raised. I would like to start, though, Mr President, by firmly thanking all those who participated in the inquiry process from all angles of this matter and from all views on this piece of legislation. It was particularly good to see a lot of engagement on it, and I certainly tried to endeavour to respect that engagement every step of the way and make sure that I was taking that into consideration. I also like to particularly thank the other committee members and the Secretariat who helped to facilitate this inquiry as we progressed with it. At the outset, Mr President, I will note, as I did in my contribution to the debate on the motion to send the bill to the committee for inquiry in this place, that the decisions and the behaviour of the government that have landed us all in this less than ideal situation in many ways has likely been highly damaging to many Tasmanians and many greyhounds in Tasmania. The Rockcliffe government has put, I think, animal welfare and human welfare at greater risk because of the way that it has made those decisions and the way we've then progressed from this in the context of those decisions. I maintain that given the situation the government has thrust us into, we are left having to make the best of this situation we are in and to proceed as carefully and respectfully as possible in this situation while balancing the full range of interests that we have to be mindful of serving here without getting too distracted by a question about how the government arrived at its decision and what it did. And I know that's something that's upset people, but this report is about a bill, and so I'm going to be focusing in on that, and that's what the report focused in on. I do absolutely acknowledge, though, Mr President, it's an incredibly uncomfortable position for many people at the moment on this issue in this state, and so many people are on tenterhooks in relation to what happens next here and the fate of this bill. But given where we started with a less than ideal circumstance for a decision-making process, this was never going to be a perfect process from that point. But let's be really clear, Mr President, here. We can't lose sight of the fact that the status quo of greyhound racing in Tasmania is not a perfect circumstance right now either. We absolutely do have animal welfare issues with dogs dying and being injured here. Every week that passes puts more animals at risk in participating in this activity on tracks in Tasmania. That's a fact, and that's not a judgment on all the people involved in this industry. It's just a fact of the activity itself. It's a highly risky activity. I think it's important to acknowledge, though, there's no way forward in progressing from an imperfect status quo that we're in that would actually have everybody involved being happy and feeling that things are being done 100% as they would wish. That's just not how progress forward on this issue will ever happen. To pretend, for example, that there was a way to progress phasing out of greyhound racing in Tasmania with which the participants in that activity would be happy and satisfied is illusory, absolutely illusory. No matter how this plays out, participants in the industry will take issue with it because they don't want it to happen, and that's really understandable. I have a lot of empathy for that. I understand it, and of course they don't want the outcome, so they're not happy with the process and will never be happy with the process. Those who are passionate participants in the activity, and I've met many people who are, Mr President, and I respect that they are, they're passionate participants in this activity of greyhound racing, they will fight every step of the way to try to maintain it as a lawful activity. No process that we could undertake with the intent of phasing it out would be acceptable or be something that they would regard as appropriate. Equally naturally, those who are passionate advocates for ending the high-risk activity of greyhound racing because of the animal welfare implications will fight tooth and nail to deliver that end as quickly as possible. They may well see anything that makes progress towards that end as good, regardless of whether it's good process or appropriate decision making, because they want the activity to end. So they're focused on that. I've got sympathy for that attitude too, that where they think this is the right way forward, it's the way that's protective of dogs and addresses clearly demonstrated welfare issues with this activity, and think that we need to get to that end through any means. So I have sympathy for both sides of this equation, that it's going to be uncomfortable regardless of how any of this came about. So, Mr. President, given all that, I would honestly say that while we continue to find ourselves in what I think we could all agree is a less than ideal process, we must take a practical approach to it and do the best we can on the facts of it. So that's the approach that I took as a committee member in the inquiry on the bill. Mr. President, I listened carefully to the arguments made in this place during the debate on the motion to send the bill to the committee for the inquiry, and I was mindful of ensuring that some of the concerns that were raised were addressed during the inquiry process. Front of mind for me was ensuring that, and in that, the concerns raised, I think, that were probably most prominent that I wanted to make sure we looked at properly in the committee process were the following things. The concern about lack of consultation on the bill before it was tabled in the Parliament, and the importance of participants in the greyhound racing industry having an opportunity to raise issues and concerns about the bill in a structured way and to be heard in a structured way and have queries on specific matters in the bill dealt with in a structured way. Those concerns that hadn't happened prior to the bill being tabled was something I took with me into this inquiry and were priorities for me in my approach to the inquiry. I think if people had the time or taken the time or were inclined to read the Hansard of our hearings, they would probably see that fairly clearly demonstrated in my approach to things. To be very clear though, it was, I think, absolutely the case that the referral of the bill to the Committee for Inquiry was not intended to be a full inquiry into the underlying policy question of the bill. That wasn't in the terms of reference that came to us. The motion for referral from this place to the committee was that the greyhound racing legislation amendments phasing out Reform Bill 2025 be referred to the Joint Standing Committee on Greyhound Racing Transition for consideration and report. Now, Mr. President, that's pretty clear. When bills go for inquiry to a committee, there's a fairly clear process that happens where you go through the bill pretty closely, and that's the focus of the inquiry and that's the focus of the reporting of the inquiry. I do realise, though, Mr. President, and absolutely acknowledge that many people feel there should have been some form of comprehensive inquiry into greyhound racing as a precursor to the government's policy announcement to phase it out.
We did that in 2015-16 though.
Sure, but people still felt that there hadn't been something contemporary done in that space, and that would have been one potential way to arrive at a policy decision of this sort. Sometimes that's what happens. Sometimes there is a parliamentary inquiry that makes recommendations that a government of the day responds to and makes a policy decision. Sometimes that's the pathway for it. But in fairness, that's not what happened this time. And governments do make significant policy decisions all the time that have not been arrived at as a result of that particular parliamentary inquiry process, but through other considerations, which may or may not have been something that happened as a part of a public process. So regardless of the government's abrupt decision on the matter and any criticism we may make, and I've made them, Mr. President, of the circumstances of that decision, the inquiry here was not about the merits of those circumstances of decision-making, nor was it about the merits of the overarching policy. That simply was not in the scope of this inquiry, and we didn't take evidence in a broad way like that. Now, of course, Mr President, that doesn't mean that members here in this place aren't absolutely entitled to form their own views on the merits of the overarching policy behind this bill. That is something we do in this place every sitting day when we're considering legislation. When it comes time to vote on the bill at some point, I know that some members here may well cast their votes on the basis of their view of the underlying policy to which it gives effect, and that's entirely available to them. I hope, though, that they do that having availed themselves of full information about that policy and don't necessarily do it in a reactionary way because of, I think, valid criticisms about the government's initial process. Just because there were criticisms of that doesn't mean that we can't now eventually arrive at proper consideration of this bill and this matter in this place. Mr President, I'd like to make some comment on the timelines within which this inquiry occurred, because it has been a matter of comment and some criticism from others. And I think I want to be really fair in my comments on this, Mr President. It is accurate to say that the inquiry on this bill occurred in a relatively short time frame. And I accept that some people may feel uncomfortable about that. Typically, inquiries on bills tend to be a quicker process than, say, a broad-ranging inquiry on a more on a bigger policy matter. I mean, we all know, Mr President, in this place I've been a member of committees of inquiry on particular matters that have gone on for quite some years, big broad-ranging ones. But when it comes to an inquiry on a bill, you've got a fairly prescribed focus to go through the clauses and the arrangements of that bill. So we would expect it to be somewhat quicker. However, as I said, I understand that some people might feel uncomfortable about a tight time frame, and I do think it's probably not ideal, but I also don't accept that the time frame that was undertaken for this inquiry was inappropriate or that it resulted in flawed consideration of the bill. As a background, I think we need to remember a few key things, and I just point a few out here. After the government's announcement last August that Greyhound racing participants, that Greyhound racing would be brought to an end and phased out over a period of years, we did have a situation where initially participants in the industry had refused to be part of consultation processes being established by the Racing Commissioner to inform the transition process. And again, I make no judgment on that. They were probably pretty shell-shocked by the circumstances around everything, and that's understandable. It was identified, though, quite quickly that legislation would need to be progressed to give effect to early requirements for a process of transition to ensure the process could be undertaken with integrity. And so the bill began to be developed in consultation with the Racing Integrity Commissioner and the working group that he had established. And we had a bill first tabled on the 6th of November, which was passed by the House of Assembly a month later. And then on the 10th of December, the bill was referred by this place to the Joint Standing Committee for the inquiry. And I'm very mindful, Mr President, the committee was already, of course, in place and had already been conducting hearings during November. And we had heard from the Racing Integrity Commissioner about the need for there to be some urgency about legislating certain matters very early in a transition process to ensure the welfare on two fronts. And he's always been very clear in his public statements about this, the welfare of animals and the welfare of people involved in the industry, and that certain things need to be put in place urgently at an early stage of transition so that we can mindfully look after welfare on both those fronts as effectively as possible and with integrity and accountability. He's been very clear in evidence he provided to the committee both in November, before this inquiry on the bill was established, and then also during the inquiry on the bill. It's on the public record, very clear that in a situation of not putting legislated structure around the early stages of transition, we risk the welfare of people and animals, and we risk an unregulated, deteriorating situation that will be highly detrimental. So I was very cognizant of that clear advice to us from the independent Racing Integrity Commissioner, which then put us to mind, well, if this has been referred to us in early December, we know we have an opportunity to do potential committee work across a period of time while we're not sitting across the summer break, that we would responsibly need to get moving with this work. So it was a tight timeframe to get things in place before Christmas, so we did endeavour to find a way to get at least those early stages underway, because the press go with those early meetings, Mr President, is mostly about advertising a period of consultation that people can make submissions in, and then planning ahead for future work. So the inquiry was commenced and submissions opened on the 20th of December. It was a submission period of 7 weeks, closing on the 6th of February. I acknowledge that it is absolutely less than ideal to do that sort of process over the holiday period, Mr President. It's less than ideal. But 7 weeks is a longer than usual time period for making submissions. The bill had been in the public domain since the 6th of November, so people had had that extra time to at least have an awareness of the bill. To my mind, we did get a significant quantum of submissions made to the inquiry that covered a lot of comprehensive areas. Some of them were pro forma submissions, but many of them were comprehensive sorts of submissions that raised a range of issues. Because one of the priority matters that sort of, I think, prompted the sending of the bill to an inquiry with the committee was that lack of broad consultation on the bill during its development stage, including the lack of an exposure draft being put out for consultation. I think this sort of 7-week period for people to make submissions, in essence, was about trying to make sure we could fill that gap so that things that people might raise and may have raised in an exposure draft stage of legislation development could be raised during this committee of inquiry process. And it did provide an opportunity, I think, for people to have a say and to raise issues and concerns. We were then able to test those in hearings. And then what we did also, and for members here who haven't necessarily had the chance to engage with the committee's materials that are available in terms of evidence, we have the submissions, we have the hearing transcripts, but what we also did is put a very extensive, comprehensive series of questions on notice to the government. My focus on that, because I had gone through the submissions and made very clear notes about the areas, the specific questions and areas in the bill that the industry participants in particular had questions about or concerns about. And so I wanted to make sure we had put to the government each of those questions and concerns and got a response on them, so that set of questions on notice to the government and the answers they supplied back to us are a really important part of the evidence of the inquiry as well. I believe that through each of those processes, or through the combination of those processes, we covered and took evidence on the full range of areas that people had raised concerns about. Just take a brief sip of water, Mr. President. Can feel myself getting croaky. So that process of the inquiry, I think, again, was it ideal? No. I think I can understand people making criticisms of it. They're probably pretty readily available criticisms to make. But I can genuinely say, Mr. President, that I think the bill, which was the focus of the inquiry, the bill got comprehensively examined through the process. I think anybody who reads this inquiry report that we're noting today, you can't read this report and say that the industry participants, the voice and concerns of industry participants are not reflected in this report.
Very strongly so.
They are absolutely the dominant voice through this report. Yep. The overwhelming representation in these pages is from industry participants covering matters that were raised by them in the evidence they put to the committee. Absolutely. So While I understand criticisms of process, I think you also have to look at product at the end of the process. And I think if you look at the product here, actually it's a comprehensive look at this bill. And the fact that it has come out and, as I said, to some extent functioned similarly to an exposure draft consultation on the bill, it's resulted in the committee making a whole series of cogent recommendations to the government about ways to make amendments to this bill that will deliver greater confidence and certainty. Primarily, that's what I characterise the thrust of the recommendations being. And the government, to its credit, has responded to that and acknowledged and endeavoured to meet those recommendations through a series of now proposed amendments that they've, I think, tabled, or no, they're going to table or attempt on the bill. So I think that the totality of that process has delivered a comprehensive and defensible examination of this bill. It's resulted in suggested adjustments to the bill, improvements to the bill, if you will. As I said, mostly I see those as being not because the bill was flawed in the first place necessarily even, but to deliver absolute greater certainty and clarity for anybody engaging with it. So that's my comment on process. So I'll move on to a couple of other matters that have come up in the inquiry. And Mr. President, I think to sort of set the tone for things, I think I've always been quite clear about my view on the overarching policy matter. I do think we should bring this activity of greyhound racing to an end. I do think that that's on the basis of the fact that it's an inherently and irredeemably dangerous activity to put dogs to, primarily for the purposes of being gambled on, but just the activity itself cannot be made safe. It cannot be made safe. And I know that in this context, many people raise other animal welfare concerns related to the conditions in which animals are kept and housed and looked after in this industry. In some ways, I find that potentially distracting. Because what I know about the industry and what I've learnt and had made clear to me is it's a very varied industry. So there are people participating in this industry who are lovely, heartfelt people who love their dogs, who care for them dearly, who provide good conditions and really positive conditions in which they live. And then there are people in this industry too that are treating dogs terribly. And there's ample evidence from from every jurisdiction that this activity exists. They simply are. There's people in this industry who do bad things to dogs and who treat dogs very poorly. I would put all of that aside because, Mr. President, and I just want to be very clear about my view, even if we could make every condition that a greyhound racing dog lived in perfect, the fact that they are put to racing on a track, to run at speed around a track, it's an inherently dangerous activity that puts them at high risk. Yep. And inevitably you will have dogs seriously injured and dying as a result of it. So for me, that's the crux of the matter in terms of welfare. That's the crux of the matter. So moving on from that, I'm just going to talk about a couple of things in the report. I know the member for Hobart went through the findings and recommendations. I won't do that in great detail. I do just want to reinforce a couple of things. Largely, matters raised in evidence to the committee that were concerns about the bill, I think were addressed. I'll put that on the record right now. So when, for example, people raised issues about concerns that a welfare void might exist once racing was phased out and greyhounds were no longer under the current rules that exist for them in the racing situation, that was shown to be